There are instances where they will pop a residue, but it's the animal's fault. It's not yours. I've had that happen. Have an inactive kidney that results in a residue years later. Okay? Another soapbox. I don't know how many of you implant, but I want to just give you a little side note on implants. Implants are a technology. So, are implants, does it adulterate the product? Does it make meat safe or unwholesome? Does it adulterate the product in any way? That's a fair question to be asked. Why do we implant cattle? Well, to increase feed efficiency, right? That's really what it is. We produce more pounds of beef with this technology than we do without it. It's nice to sell calves as all natural. I support that effort 100%. But I don't throw rocks at conventional beef production, because one of the things is we're still feeding the world. We cannot produce the same amount of beef all natural that we can with the technologies that are available to us. And if we're feeding the world, there's still a big portion of the consuming public that buys meat based on price. So we have to have a product, because obviously beef is a very high quality protein, and we got to produce it as cheaply as we can so that there's a portion of the consuming public that can afford it. And that's something we should never apologize for. This is a great technology, and it has a great use. But you got to know how to use them. It's very, very important with implants that you use them correctly. You puncture 2/3 of the way the year out. The proper implant site is the middle third of the year. When you slide that needle, the implant needle, into the ear, you do not inject the pellets. You start to squeeze the handle as you withdraw the needle off of them. All you do with the plunger is you hold the implants in place and you take the needle off of them. You don't want to crush those pellets. When you do that, they become a very effective tool. So the question is what about the safety of using implants? The big concern is this: estradiol 17 beta. That's the hormone that everybody is concerned about. Do we use estradiol 17 beta in implants? Yes, we do. Absolutely. Okay, so that would elevate the level of estradiol 17 beta present in that animal's tissue. Would that be correct? The answer is yes. It would elevate that. So the question is does that elevation matter? Does it adulterate the product, make it unsafe? Well, here's the deal. Here's a bunch of studies that looked at that. You know why this came in? Is because the European Union said, we will no longer allow the importing of U.S. beef because they use growth promoting hormones. To me, that was a trade barrier issue. It was never a health issue, because their own health organizations studied implants and found out they were not detrimental to health. Is that still in place? Even though they've studied it and found out implants aren't bad? And the answer is yes. That's why NHTC is so important. Non-hormone treated cattle are the only things that are eligible to the European Union. It's a trade barrier. It's not a health issue. So the question is it a problem? Nanogram, 1 part per billion. The N means not much, because that's what it is. Estrogen, 100 grams. 100 grams is what? How much of a pound? How many grams in a pound? What was it? Yep, 454. So we're going to take a little bit of liberty here and say, okay, 100 grams is a quarter pounder, because that's roughly what it is, right? We all know what a quarter pounder is. So if you ate a quarter pounder with meat from an untreated steer, you got 1.1 nanograms of estradiol 17 beta. Okay, if you ate it from an implanted steer, you got 1.4 nanograms. So what's the difference? 0.3 nanograms, right? So the question is does that matter? Well, look at peas down here, 400 nanograms. If you ate a quarter pound of peas, you got 400 nanograms. So what's that tell you? Besides, don't eat peas, right? But look at this. The important point is that estradiol 17 beta is a naturally occurring hormone that everybody's body makes every day. Well, how much? You ask, right? You ask how much? Well, look at this. Adult males, you make 168,000 nanograms of estradiol 17 beta every day. Do you think 0.3 nanograms matters? A non-pregnant female, 20 million nanograms of estradiol 17 beta is made every day. Does 0.3 nanograms make a difference? The answer is no. So is our product adulterated? When we use these technologies, does it adulterate our product? The answer is no, it does not. It is safe and wholesome. By every scientific body that has studied this issue, implants are deemed safe for use in beef production. Estradiol 17 beta, by the way, has been listed as a carcinogen by the European Union. I find that a little strange. One birth control pill contains the same amount of estrogen as 125,000 pounds of beef from an implanted steer. That's about, so the point of this is that implanting is a technology that enhances beef production and decreases the use of natural resources. Because if we increase efficiency, we can get the same pound of beef with less feed, right? Less feed, less water. So is that a technology we ought to look at and continue or consider? And the answer is yes, unless you're getting paid not to. If you're in an all-natural program, don't implant. As long as your premium makes up for the loss of production that you would have. And sometimes you need to look at that, because sometimes being all natural, you end up getting $4 a hundred, sometimes on an all natural deal. That's about what the premium is. But a lot of times with these implants, you get 20 to 25 pounds. That 20 or 25 pounds, is that more money in your pocket than what the all natural premium was? Maybe. Something to consider. But the point of this whole thing is do not apologize. This is a technology that's in use all the time anyway, and every scientific body that studied it says this is a good technology. It does not hurt our product. And so we don't apologize for this. I stole these slides from Gary Sides. He's a nutritionist. He's a really sharp guy, and he's the one that lent me those slides. So we talk about BSE, mad cow. It's caused by a prion. It's related to chronic wasting disease. It's related to scrapie in sheep. Prion diseases we don't understand very well, but they're bad news. Prions, they cause nerve cells to degenerate. They're found in nervous tissue. So one of the things that happened is in 1994, the United States banned the use of ruminant-derived proteins being fed, animal-derived proteins being fed to ruminants. So the big thing that was affected was meat and bone meal, which was a byproduct from rendering that we fed back to cattle. The problem is cooking doesn't kill prions. And so what they did is they banned that practice in 1994. When did BSE hit? When did we have the first case in the United States? It was in 2003. It was 9 years after our ban. Of course, it was a Canadian cow that first case of BSE was found. We don't understand a lot of this disease, but we do know that prions are linked to Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. This is a very severe disease that kills people. Chronic wasting disease in deer is the same mechanism. They have prions that did this. A good friend of mine, he was a day work cowboy that worked a lot of the western ranches out there, lived out there by Magdalena, went out and got his deer, died 5 months later. That deer had chronic wasting disease. So we have to make sure to protect against that practice that we never feed animal-derived proteins, especially meat and bone meal, to ruminants. There's the rule. So I'm going to touch bases quick. Any questions on that BSE thing? It's just, yep.
How do you recognize chronic wasting disease? I mean, how would you know that needs that?
Those deer generally tend to be poor. That's the only clinical sign, is that they're thin and unthrifty, which is probably why it got shot, because it was behind. You know, who knows? But, and scrapie is the same thing. Scrapie in sheep is the same mechanism. It's a prion disease too. And so we just have to be really aware of those things. And which is why in Asia you cannot send any cuts of beef. It has to be boned if it has any association with a vertebral column. It has to be boned out. You can't send like ribeyes with the bone in because part of the bone that's there had spinal canal with it, so it can't be sent to the Asian markets. So VFD, Veterinary Feed Directive, I don't know how many of you are affected by that rule, but what happened is in 2016 there was a rule put in that we were going to get into. It says that to feed, and now this is really important, it only applies to medicated feed that include antimicrobials that are deemed medically important for human medicine. That's it. Your dewormers, your coccidiostats, all that kind of stuff, they're not affected by this. This is only feed containing antimicrobials that are deemed medically important for human medicine. Okay, so if you want to feed an antibiotic in feed, you have to involve your veterinarian, period. Especially if you're going to feed classes of cattle. Because as of 2016, there were 5 ways that you could feed. There were 5 label indications for feeding. It was treatment, control, prevention, enhanced growth, and feed efficiency. Feed efficiency and growth promotion were removed from the label, so now you can only feed for prevention, control, or treatment of disease. That's it. And the important thing to understand that when it comes to a veterinary feed directive, there is no extra label use. Veterinarian can't do it, you can't do it. You have to feed medicated feed exactly as the label states, no variation. So, and it's pretty common practice for folks to feed maybe a feed containing tetracycline or aureomycin is a good example of the feed that has tetracycline in it when you wean calves. It's not unusual to do that. But now it's going to take some planning. If you want to continue that practice, you have to get with your veterinarian and get a veterinary feed directive written up. So there's 2 points I want to tell you. There's 2 things that are really important about a veterinary feed directive. It's duration of use and expiration date. Those are 2 terms you got to understand. The main thing is get with your veterinarian and make sure it's ahead of time, because this paperwork can take a bit. Okay? So if you're going to wean tomorrow, don't go tonight. You know, make sure you plan ahead to get this done, because this is all specified. Duration of use and expiration date is already specified for whatever drug you're using. So I'm going to use the example here of tilmicicin. It has an expiration date of 45 days. That means from the time you place the order, you have 45 days to complete the duration of use. So you have 45 days to get the feed ordered, get it in, and its duration of use is 21 days. So you have to get it with enough time to complete the 21-day feeding period. If you can't complete the 21 days, you can't start it. You have to get a new VFD. You have to rewrite the order. Because if you finally get your feed and you only got 20 days left before it expires, you cannot start it. Any violation of label use is a violation of law, which obviously has penalties with it. Okay? Your responsibilities is that you only, if you're going to feed medicated feed, doesn't include dewormers or anything else, if you're going to feed medicated feed, you have to have one of these in place. You have to keep the records for 2 years, and it has to be available upon request. Okay? So what's happening? How is this being regulated? Right now, the NMDA's feed and seed folks got this dumped in their lap. They don't want to do this, but they're charged with it. So they go to the feed store who bought 1 ton of tetracycline aureomycin crumbles or whatever it might be. And now they have 20 bags left. They have to account for the other 20 bags that they sold. So they have to produce the VFD records that correspond to the 20 bags that aren't on that pallet. So what do you think they're going to do? Okay, Joe Blow bought 15 of them. What do you think Joe Blow's going to get? He's going to get a visit. Show me the records that showed. Because if you bought 15 bags of medicated feed, in the duration of use, it better coincide with the number of cattle that you had to feed, and there better not be any left. Okay? It's really picky with this. Obviously, out here in New Mexico, are we going to be the target for enforcement? Probably not, but you better be aware of this stuff. Okay? So as of January 1st of 2017, all of these drugs became VFD drugs as well. So basically, all of the medications, the antimicrobials that we use commonly in food animal medicine are now VFD orders. Now this does not include if your veterinarian directs you to treat a single animal or 3 calves that are sick or whatever. It's feeding a class, feeding a set of weaned calves, feeding some heifer, whatever it might be. You have to have this to feed a class. Okay? If we don't show judicious use and accountable use of antimicrobials, we may be targeted to remove them. And in fact, when this first came up, that was the target, was to remove antimicrobials from agricultural use. In California, you cannot buy an antibiotic over the counter, including penicillin, any of those. They're gone. I think there's going to be other states that follow suit. Maybe not a bad thing, I don't know. If penicillin's our #1 residue, because it's an over-the-counter product, would that incidence be decreased if there was at least veterinary oversight over it? Probably so. I mean, there's going to be some people that don't care anyway, but we have to pay attention. So, the last thing I'm going to touch on is market cows and bulls, and the reason I touch on this is as cow-calf producers, they're a large segment of your cash flow, aren't they? We send a lot of cows to town. And the question that I ask, that we don't stop and think. When we send those weaned calves to town, how long until they're harvested? 200, 240 days? How long when we send our cow-cows until they're marketed? Sometimes it's the next day, isn't it? So what we do to those cows is especially important because tomorrow they may be harvested. But we mash our culls, don't we? We don't pay a lot of attention to them. We don't take especially great care of them. A lot of times they're the tail enders that we are going to do the last thing. We have to pay more attention to them. And the reason is because they're way closer to harvest than the others. So one of the things that's a consideration that people don't think about, a lot of times if you preg your cows and you vaccinate when you're pregnant and all this stuff, a lot of times, sometimes the cowboys will get a little ahead of the pregger. And they're already, because they've just done 600, that day, whatever, they just gave the Vibrio Lepto, and she's an open cow. Have you ever looked at the withdrawal time for Vibrio Lepto vaccines? Most of them are 60 days. But you just vaccinated that cow. She has a withdrawal associated with her now. So what are you supposed to do with her? You identify her and you cut her off, because she cannot be merchanted, cannot be sold. Things we don't think about. I was at that JBS plant. One of the things that they did, they were harvesting cows that day, and when they go to pull the hide, they said, "Oh, that one's got stripes." Stripes. She's got stripes on the top of her back. Bruises from what? A sorting stick. Whacking that cow with a sorting stick will result in a bruise that when they jerk the hide is plain right there. So we got to be careful. Those sticks, we need to not be whacking on those cows. We need to do something different, because whacking on them with that sorting stick, if there's a bruise, they have to trim it. And especially bruises along the back are complicated. So what happens? They have to stop the chain. They are not happy. The other thing really common in those culls that we see is those cows will hit their hip bone as they're going out around the krail, That is a hole about this big when they trim that bruise out of those cows. It's huge. So how big is it? Take care of them early. We know about markets. I'm not going to. Sometimes I get long-winded. I usually am. But anyway, white fat cows is kind of an important thing. This is a consideration I'm throwing out there. Almost all. Why is white fat important? What color is fat on cows out here in the country? It's yellow, right? Because they're grazing. Does yellow fat sell in the meat case? Not one bit. Because consumers want white fat. So if you want to increase the value of those cows, one of the things you can do is feed them concentrates for a while, because most of our cull cattle tend to be thin. If you fed them for a bit and fed them up a little bit, you got to look, maybe it won't pencil out. Maybe you're better off just sending them and taking the hickey for yellow fat. Maybe that's the case. But white fat cows have more value. And the problem with it is what cows are white fat now? dairy cattle. So most of our cow meat, white fat meat, is dairy cows. Okay? So the question comes, but who cares? What happens to those cow cattle? They go to McDonald's, right? I mean, they get ground. They made ground beef and they're sold at McDonald's and Burger King and all that, right? Maybe not so much. So Dr. Belk up at CSU did a survey of cow harvest plants and asked them specifically that question. Do you grind or cut all these different cuts? And here was the answer. 100% of the plants cut the ribs and the loins into steaks, not ground. Look at this. 85% of the rounds, flanks, cut into primals, not ground. 57% of the chucks, not ground, into primal cuts. The point of this is why do we import so much beef into the United States? Because we grind it. Why do we grind it? Because we're selling steaks even out of our cow cattle. Where does it go? And the answer is food service. Casinos and stuff like that. The demand for that, for cuts of meat and that, is greater than we can supply, so we don't grind our cow cattle. We put them in a box and we buy meat to grind and send to McDonald's. So what we have to do is realize that those cattle are going to be in somebody's box in a short period of time, which means what we have to do is realize that and pay more attention to our cow cattle. We need to be careful with that.